The morning New Orleans woke up to the death of Silas Duquesne. Dinah Vance was standing in her kitchen in yesterday's shirt, watching her own words scroll across the television, and thinking, very calmly, "I am going to die today." The anchor was reading it aloud. Her sentences, her rhythms, the obituary she had written in secret over 2 years, and locked in a file that was never, under any circumstances, supposed to see daylight while its subject was breathing. Silas Duquesne, 44, called by federal prosecutors the most untouchable man on the Gulf Coast, died Thursday. He is survived by a city that never knew him. Her phone had 41 missed calls. The Ledger's website had crashed twice from traffic. Somewhere across town, in the newsroom's ancient content system, a scheduled publish queue had glitched at 3:07 a.m. and pushed every advance obituary on file. The mayor, 2 retired quarterbacks, a beloved jazz trumpeter, and 1 crime lord lived to the front page. The others had been pulled within the hour, corrected with apologies. But you cannot unring a cathedral bell, and you cannot unpublish the secret conscience of a man who has spent 30 years making sure the world believed he didn't have one. Because that was the thing that had Dinah's hands shaking as she poured coffee she would not drink. Every other paper's advance file on Silas Duquesne was a rap sheet with adjectives. Hers wasn't. Hers was 2 years of quiet, obsessive research that no editor had assigned, and no editor knew about. The free clinic in Tremé, funded through a shell charity, with a name like a law firm. The fleet of flat-bottom boats that appeared out of nowhere during Hurricane Delphine and pulled 300 people off their roofs, then vanished before the news cameras arrived. The music school in the 9th Ward, where no child had ever been asked for tuition, whose anonymous benefactor the principal would only describe, once, in a whisper, as a man who asked us never to thank him. Dinah had followed the money the way other reporters never bothered to, because obituary writers have a strange kind of patience, the patience of people who work in finished lives. And she had found, buried under the fear and the violence and the empire, a second, hidden ledger of mercy. She had written it all down, every soft spot, every secret kindness, everything a ruthless man cannot afford to have known about him. And now, every rival, every ambitious lieutenant, and every federal agent on the Gulf Coast was reading it with their morning coffee. The knock came at 8:15. Not a knock, really. A single, unhurried rap, the kind that isn't asking. Dinah looked through the peephole and felt the floor of her life give way. Then, because she was her father's daughter, and her father used to say the only way out of the swamp is through it, she opened the door. Silas Duquesne stood on her sagging porch in the gray drizzle, alone, holding a rain-spotted copy of the morning paper. He was taller than the photographs, quieter than the legends, and his eyes were the color of the river under stormlight. He looked at her for a long moment, long enough for her heartbeat to fill the whole street, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low and unhurried and almost gentle, which was the most frightening thing about it. "Miss Vance," said the dead man on her porch, "I've just had the strangest experience of my life. I've read my own obituary." He held up the paper. The ink was running in the rain like something bleeding, and I find I have only one question. She waited. The whole city seemed to wait. "Who?" Silas Duquesne asked softly. "Have you been talking to?" She didn't answer him on the porch. She didn't answer him in the black car that carried her, not forced, precisely, but not optional either, through the wet, waking streets of the quarter, past the shuttered galleries and the balconies dripping with last night's rain and beads. She didn't answer him in the courtyard of a Creole townhouse on Royal Street, where Jasmine climbed the brick and 2 men with careful eyes pretended to garden. She answered him with the only sentence she had. "I don't burn sources. Ever. You can ask me anything else." They were sitting across an iron table under a banana tree, and Silas Duquesne studied her the way she imagined he studied ships coming into his port: cargo, flag, and intention. He had not threatened her. That was the part her nervous system couldn't process. Every scenario she'd run on the drive over had ended in a threat, and instead he had poured her chicory coffee with his own hands and asked about her drive. "Miss Vance." He turned his cup a quarter turn on its saucer, a small, precise habit she would come to know. "Let me explain your situation, since your newspaper certainly won't. This morning, 40,000 people read a detailed map of everything I love. The clinic, the boats, the school." Something crossed his face at the word school. fast as a fish underwater. For 30 years, I have paid a great deal of money and done a number of unforgivable things to make sure no such map existed. A man in my position survives by being a fortress with no doors. You have just published the doors. I didn't publish anything, Dinah said. A server did. The server printed it. You wrote it. He leaned forward slightly, and the courtyard got smaller. 2 years of financial forensics that my own accountants believed was invisible. Details about the Delphine boats that only 4 living people know. And a quote, he opened the wet paper with terrible care, found the line without searching, because of course he had memorized it. He was a man who did his kindness in the dark and his violence in the dark, and perhaps could no longer tell which one he was hiding. He looked up. No database gave you that sentence, Miss Vance. That sentence knows me. So I will ask one more time, politely. Who have you been talking to? And I'll answer one more time, politely, Dinah said, and heard her own voice come out steady, which surprised them both. No, the silence lasted 11 seconds. She counted. Somewhere beyond the wall, a streetcar bell rang. Absurd and ordinary. You understand, Silas said finally, conversationally, that people don't refuse me. I understand that everyone you meet is either afraid of you or wants something from you, Dinah said. I'm plenty afraid, but I don't want anything, and I don't have anything to trade. And the one thing I do have is the one thing I don't sell. So we're at what my daddy called a Louisiana standoff. Both of us stuck in the same mud. And then Silas Duquesne did the thing that would rearrange both their lives. He laughed. It was quiet and short and clearly out of practice, the laugh of a man whose face had forgotten the shape of it, and it was gone in a second, replaced by something more dangerous. Interest. Baptiste, he said without raising his voice. A gray-bearded man materialized from the jasmine. Miss Vance will be needing protection. I don't want— It isn't for you, Silas said, standing, buttoning his jacket, already somewhere else in his mind. Everyone who read that obituary now believes you know where my heart is kept. Half of them will want to buy that knowledge. The other half will want to make sure no one else can. You became the most dangerous woman in New Orleans at 3:07 this morning, Miss Vance. At the courtyard gate, he paused and looked back at her. And for the first time, she saw underneath the stillness just a flicker, there and gone, like heat lightning behind a levee. And I intend to find out how you did it. The attacks began that night. The free clinic in Treme, first a firebomb through the back window at 2 a.m., caught by sprinklers Silas had installed and no one had ever asked about. Then the boathouse on Bayou Street, John, where the Delphine fleet slept under tarps. 2 men with bolt cutters and gasoline, interrupted by guards who hadn't been there a week earlier. The message was unmistakable. Someone was reading Dinah's obituary like a target list and burning it, line by line. Dinah learned all this at dawn, standing in the wet street outside the clinic with the smell of char in her hair, because she had made Baptiste drive her there the moment the scanner traffic came through, and because guilt is its own kind of gravity, Silas was already there. He stood in the ruined doorway in his shirt sleeves, soot on his hands, and he was not directing his men, not making calls, not being a king. He was carrying boxes, files, medicine, a child's drawing in a smoke-stained frame, carrying them out to dry ground himself. Methodically, in the rain, while his soldiers watched their untouchable boss do manual labor with an expression the clinic's old nurse would later describe as a man cleaning up after his own funeral. He saw Dinah across the police tape. He crossed to her, and the officers looked away with practiced unanimity. Go home, Miss Vance. I did this. Her voice cracked on it. This place stood for 9 years because nobody knew, and I wrote it down. And now, Silas said, quietly, I know something I did not know yesterday. He looked back at the smoking clinic, and his voice dropped into the register she would come to think of as the truth register, the one that lived under all the others. Whoever did this had my security schedules. The guards' rotation changed 6 days ago. The firebomb came through the one window that wasn't wired yet. His river-colored eyes came back to her. Your obituary gave them the what, Miss Vance. But somebody inside my house is giving them the when. The words landed in her chest like stones. Somebody inside my house. Then why are you telling me? For a moment he didn't answer. Rain ran off the clinic's ruined gutter between them. A little silver curtain. Because you are the only person in this city, Silas said, who has proven she can know my secrets and keep them. I have an empire full of loyal men, Miss Vance, and this morning I trust exactly one obituary writer. He stepped back, already turning. Baptiste stays with you. That is no longer a request. What followed was 2 weeks of the strangest arrangement in Dinah Vance's life, and, she would admit much later, only to him, only in the dark, the most alive she had ever felt. Because Silas Duquesne set out to protect everything she had written about, and he made her come with him. His logic was cold and airtight. Her research had found doors his own security never knew existed, which meant her eyes worked differently than his, which made her useful. Her presence was operational. That was the story he told her, and Baptiste, and himself. So she rode in the back of the armored Suburban through the humid nights while Silas hardened the map of his own heart, and she watched him. And she took notes, because taking notes was how Dinah Vance survived being alive. She watched him walk the halls of the music school in the 9th Ward after hours, checking window locks with his own hands, and pause, just pause, 3 full seconds in the doorway of the trumpet room. She watched a 9-year-old girl at the school's evening program march straight up to the most feared man on the Gulf Coast and demand to know if he was somebody's daddy, and she watched the king of the river answer, with complete gravity, "No, Cher. I'm the janitor," and fix the girl's music stand. She watched him become, in her presence, incrementally and against his will, a person, and he watched her back. She felt it constantly, that unhurried, cataloging attention, the same quality she'd heard in his voice on her porch. He noticed she took her coffee with condensed milk and had it waiting. He noticed she flinched at sudden gunshots on the news, but not at real danger, and asked her about it exactly once, and listened to the answer: a father, a hunting accident, a girl who learned to be calm in emergencies, because falling apart hadn't saved anyone with a stillness so total it felt like being held. He never touched her. He held doors, guided her through crowds with a hand that hovered an inch from the small of her back like a compass needle refusing its pole, wrapped his jacket around her shoulders on the night ferry without letting his fingers land. Once, in the school's darkened hallway, a floorboard's groan spun them both and left them 6 inches apart, her hand flat against his chest, his pulse hammering under her palm at a speed that had nothing to do with fear, and Silas Duquesne, who was afraid of nothing, stepped back, like a man stepping back from a ledge. "This is a mistake," he said, roughly, to the hallway, to the universe, to himself. "The floorboard? The obituary." His voice was low and uneven, the truth register. "It should have made me hate you. You unlocked every door I have. Instead, I find that He stopped, rebuilt himself in real time. She watched it happen, stone by stone. "Baptiste will take you home." That night, unable to sleep, Dinah stood at her window and saw the black Suburban still parked across the flooded street at 3 a.m., engine off, rain hammering the roof, and a shape in the driver's seat that was not Baptiste, keeping a watch he would never report and never admit. Alone in the dark outside her apartment, like a lighthouse that had somehow gone to sea. She never told him she'd seen. But she stopped locking the deadbolt's second lock, a small, insane act of trust, and somehow, though she never said it, she knew that he knew. The unraveling began with the funeral notice. It was Baptiste who found it buried in the back pages of a parish weekly, a paid announcement in the old formal style. A memorial mass for Silas Alaric Duquesne will be celebrated November 1, All Saints' Day, Street Roch Chapel. No family name attached. No contact. Placed in cash. Dinah didn't understand why the courtyard on Royal Street went silent when Baptiste laid the clipping on the iron table. She didn't understand why 2 of the older men crossed themselves. Silas understood immediately. She watched the understanding move through him like cold water. "It's the old," he said at worst. His voice was very quiet, from my grandfather's time, when the families wanted a killing sanctioned public. Agreed. No retaliation, they didn't send letters. They published the man's obituary while he was alive, and then a mass announcement with a date. He set his coffee down without drinking it. The obituary declares the target. The date sets the appointment. Every old family on the Gulf reads the death pages. Miss Vance. It's the last newspaper habit our world kept. His eyes lifted to hers, and what was in them? made her cold in the wet heat of the courtyard. Your glitch was never a glitch. Someone used your newspaper, used you to serve a death warrant, in the old style. And this morning, they published the date. I have 11 days. The room tilted. Dinah gripped the iron table. That's insane. It's a server error. The IT department confirmed the queue. The queue was accessed remotely at 2:51 a.m., Baptiste said quietly, 16 minutes before the publish, through a Ledger employee login. We've had your papers logs for a week. He hesitated, the first hesitation Dinah had ever seen from him, and looked at his boss. The login belonged to the advertising department, the account that places the Duquesne business's legal notices, the account only one person outside the paper had ever handled. Remy, Silas said. He said his nephew's name the way you say a word in a language you're realizing you never actually spoke. Remy Duquesne. Dinah had met him twice in those 2 weeks. 31. Beautiful, the way a knife is beautiful. The only son of Silas's dead brother, raised in Silas's house after the ambush that made Silas an orphan maker's orphan at 19. Remy ran the family's legitimate face. The shipping concern, the restaurants, the charity galas. He was charming to waiters, generous to musicians, and he had kissed Dinah's hand and thanked her, with apparently bottomless warmth, for writing the only honest thing anyone ever published about my uncle. He had also, the evidence now showed, spent 2 years quietly courting the old family's council, the graying dons of Biloxi and Homa and Lake Charles, who resented Silas's clinics and schools as sentimentality, weakness, money bleeding out of the life, and he had made them an old-world offer, sanctioned the removal of the soft king, and inherit a nephew who would run the Gulf the old way. The obituary had been his masterstroke. He hadn't needed to write a case against his uncle. He'd simply published Dinah's the beautiful, humanizing, loving obituary that proved to every hard man on the coast that Silas Duquesne had gone soft, and let the king's own secret conscience convict him. He didn't leak your map to destroy the things you love, Dinah said slowly, sick with the seeing of it. They were in the townhouse study, storm coming, the barometer falling like a stone, the firebombs, the boathouse, those were demonstrations. For the council, proof that you'd bleed for those places. Every time you personally carried boxes out of a burning clinic, you were testifying against yourself. Silas stood at the window with his back to her, watching the first fat drops hit the courtyard. He had been silent for a long time. I raised him, he said finally. After my brother died, I promised his mother, I promised her grave, that the boy would never go hungry, never be afraid, never be alone. The lightning caught his reflection in the glass, and Dinah saw his face the way she was never meant to, undefended. I kept him out of the violence. I thought I was protecting him. He thought I was insulting him. A muscle moved in his jaw. He wants the throne, Miss Vance, and he has learned the oldest lesson of my family better than I ever taught it. You don't take a king with an army. He turned from the window. You take him with a story. Then we tell a better one. He looked at her. You have 11 days and an enemy whose only weapon is a narrative, Dinah said, and stood up, because some sentences can't be said sitting down. Remy's entire coup rests on one claim, that your kindness makes you weak, that the man in my obituary can't also be the man they fear. He's betting his life that those are two different people. Her heart was slamming. She said it anyway. I've spent 2 years learning they're not. Let me prove it. Publicly. Give me the one thing you've never given anyone, which is your source, Dinah said. Mine. It's time you knew. And Silas, his given name, out loud, for the first time, and it stopped him like a hand on his chest. You need to sit down for this. She took him there herself, through the storm, to a white columned house in the Garden District, with camellias drowning in the rain, a private nursing home so discreet it had no sign, only a live oak older than the state. She watched Silas Duquesne read the name on the visitor's ledger where she signed them in, watched him read it twice. Resident, Odette Duquesne, visitor of record twice monthly, 2 years. D. Vance. No. His voice had no color in it at all. My mother died 11 years ago. Lake Charles. I buried. He stopped. Dinah watched a lifetime of certainty crack down the middle. I buried a casket. You buried what your uncle's people told you to bury, Dinah said gently. In 2015, your mother testified in secret to a federal grand jury Not against you, Silas. For you, against the Marcello faction that killed your brother, to close the case that was going to be pinned on you. The government's price was her disappearance. She chose it. She's been 11 minutes from your house for 11 years, under her own name. Because she said Dinah's voice caught. She pushed through it. She said no one ever looks for the dead in the phone book. And you found her. I found her the way I find everything. Death records that didn't reconcile. A casket bought, but never it doesn't matter. Dinah swallowed. I came to interview her for 1 hour, 2 years ago, for the advance file. I've come back every 2 weeks since, and I never printed a word. Because those visits stopped being journalism after the first afternoon. Everything in that obituary, the clinics, the boats, the school, that sentence you memorized, Silas. I didn't investigate your conscience. Your mother narrated it. She has kept a scrapbook of every anonymous thing you've ever done. She figured you out from a nursing home with a library card and a telephone, because she is exactly as relentless as her son. Dinah stepped back from the door and put the visitor's badge in his shaking hand. Room 11. She takes her tea at 4. She knows you're coming, I called ahead. And then, softly, she's been waiting 11 years to tell you why. Silas Duquesne feared from Corpus Christi to Mobile, unmoved at gravesides and grand juries. The man with the river in his eyes stood in the hallway of a Garden District nursing home holding a plastic badge and could not make his feet move. Dinah. Her name. Not Miss Vance. His voice came apart on it, quietly, completely. The truth register with nothing underneath it anymore. What does a man say? You say hi, Mama, Dinah said. She'll handle the rest. She's been rehearsing. She waited in the garden for 2 hours while the storm washed the city, and through the window of room 11, she could see them, the small, fierce, white-haired woman and the king of the Gulf Coast on his knees beside her chair, with his face in her hands, and Odette Duquesne stroking her son's hair the way you gentle something wild. Both of them talking, both of them weeping. 11 years pouring out onto a nursing home carpet, and Dinah Vance, who worked in Finished Lives, stood in the rain and understood she was watching one get unfinished. When Silas finally came out, his eyes were wrecked, and his voice was steady, and he looked at her the way no one had ever looked at her, the way you look at the person who handed you back your dead. You kept my mother, he said, for 2 years. A story that would have won you a Pulitzer. A secret worth more than my whole empire to my enemies. And you kept her because she's a person, not a source. Because she asked me to wait until you were safe. Dinah lifted her chin. And because I don't burn sources. I believe I mentioned. He crossed the wet grass. And this time, he did not stop at the ledge. He took her face in both hands carefully, like a man handling the one page of a book that everything else was written to protect, and kissed her in the rain under the drowning camellias, and it was slow and shaking and 11 years deep. And when they finally broke apart, his forehead against hers, he said, hoarse and wondering, you wrote that I could no longer tell which one I was hiding, the kindness or the violence. I did. You were wrong, Cher. His thumb traced her cheekbone. I always knew. I was hiding the kindness. Because the last time the world knew what I loved, his breath faltered. The world took it. And now Remy has published the list. Above them, thunder rolled in off the Gulf. 8 days to All Saints'. Then we take the pen back, Dinah said. They planned it in the townhouse study like a war and a wedding at once. And the plan was Dinah's. And it was beautiful and insane in the New Orleans way. Remy's coup lived and died on the old code, the sanctioned mass on All Saints' Day, the council's blessing, the theater of legitimacy. He needed Silas dead by the ritual, in front of the families, so no blood feud could follow. That was the code's whole point. A killing everyone had signed, so Silas would give them the ritual. On All Saints' morning, the bells of Street, Roach Chapel rang over the little cemetery of white tombs and rain-scrubbed angels, and the old families came dons from 3 states in black, wary and armed and curious, summoned by a second announcement in the same parish weekly, placed in the same old style that had made the entire Gulf Coast underworld choke on its coffee. The family of Silas Alaric Duquesne invites the honored families to his memorial mass, All Saints' Day, Street Roach, where the deceased will personally deliver the eulogy. They came because no one in 50 years had ever seen the code answered with a joke. They came because you cannot not come. And Silas Duquesne attended his own funeral. He walked up the chapel's center aisle at 11 o'clock, alive, unhurried, in immaculate black, past his own framed photograph and a casket he had rented himself, past Remy, whose face went from triumph to arithmetic, to the particular gray of a man watching his masterpiece catch fire, and he stood in front of the altar of a chapel his great-grandfather had helped rebuild, and he addressed the assembled kings of his world. "Gentlemen, thank you for coming to my funeral." A ripple. Someone's nervous laugh strangled itself. "You were told I've gone soft. You were shown a beautiful obituary, as evidence clinics, boats, a music school. You were told a man who loves things can't hold the river." He let the silence stretch until it creaked. "Here's what my nephew forgot to teach you about that obituary. He forgot to ask who wrote it, and what else she found." And Dinah Vance stepped out of the sacristy with a folder, walked to the lectern of Street Roch Chapel in front of the most dangerous congregation in the South, and did the one thing she had trained her whole life to do. She read the dead their story. Except the story was Remy's. 2 weeks of her forensics and Baptiste's logs, delivered in the flat, unimpeachable cadence of the death pages, the remote login, time-stamped, the cash, placed announcements, traced, the payments to the firebombers of a children's clinic, documented a children's clinic, gentlemen, in a war of grown men, and then the ledger that ended it. The one Dinah had found the way she found everything. In records nobody reconciles. Remy's escrow account in Grand Cayman, funded 8 months ago, by the Marcello faction, the family that had murdered Silas's brother, Remy's own father. The chapel did not erupt. It did something far worse, in that world. It went cold, because the code had rules older than any of them, and Remy had broken the only unforgivable one. He had taken foreign money to sell his own blood, and dressed it in the family's sacred ritual. He hadn't asked the council to sanction a succession. He had used their code, their signatures, their attendance today as props in a Marcello contract. Every Don in the room had been made an accomplice to his own humiliation. Remiran. Of course he ran out the side door into the white cemetery, into the rain, and Dinah would remember the next 60 seconds for the rest of her life in freeze frames. Remy's gun coming up, not aimed at Silas, aimed at her, at the lectern, at the woman whose pen had killed him. The crash of pews and Silas Duquesne crossing the chapel like weather, like the river taking a levee, putting his body between the bullet and the obituary writer with an economy that made it clear he had decided to do this days ago, in any version of events, without needing to think. The shot took him high in the shoulder and spun him into her, and they went down together between the pews, her hands already pressed to the blood, his face already checking hers face. Hands, breathing with the frantic arithmetic of a man counting his one treasure after a fire. "You're hit," she was saying. "Silas, I know where I'm hit." His voice, absurdly, was calm the truth register, steady as bedrock, while his blood ran through her fingers. "Dinah, look at me. This is important." And the king of the Gulf Coast, bleeding in his own rented funeral, looked up at her with the river in his eyes and said, "That was worth it. Whatever happens in the next 5 minutes, you are the best thing I have ever taken a bullet for." And the list, Cher, is not short. Whatever happened in the next 5 minutes was, in the end, brief and biblical. Remy made it 40 feet into the cemetery before he ran out of allies, because the Dons of 3 states had followed him out into the rain. And the old code had one final clause, and it did not require Silas to lift a finger. Dinah never asked what happened among the white tombs of Street Roch, and Silas never told her. And the parish weekly, 2 weeks later, ran a small paid notice in the old formal style announcing that Remy Duquesne had left the country to pursue opportunities abroad. In that world, everyone understood the tense. The rest, the city watched happen in public, and misunderstood beautifully, which suited everyone. The ledger ran a correction for the ages, and a profile that won prizes. The obituary writer whose accidental masterpiece had exposed a coup, saved a crime lord, and reunited a mother with her son, the last part rendered, carefully, as a human interest miracle with all the years filed off. The federal file on Silas Duquesne did not close, but it changed flavor. The new U.S. attorney was heard to remark, off the record, that it was difficult to build a jury's hatred for a man whose known crimes now included a children's music school, hurricane boats, and getting shot in a church protecting a journalist. Dinah quit the death pages that spring. Her editor wept and called it a tragedy. Dinah called it a change of beat. She was writing a book now, a long one, a true one, about the hidden history of mercy in a violent city, and her primary source received her twice a month in a garden district garden, with tea at 4, and criticized her sentence rhythms, and was teaching her gumbo, and had begun, with the terrifying directness of a woman who had spent 11 years dead, to ask pointed questions about grandchildren. "Mama," Silas would say, in the warning tone that moved harbor masters and did nothing at all to Odette Duquesne. "I died once already. Bebe," his mother would reply serenely, pouring. "I have no more time for patience." Ask the girl. He asked the girl in October, at dusk, on the levee where the river bends toward the Gulf, no ring at first. Just the two of them and the freighters sliding past like lit cities, and Silas Duquesne turning his cup of coffee a quarter turn in his hands because some habits are load-bearing. "I've been rewriting something," he said. "For a year now. I want your professional opinion." And he handed her a single folded page. And Dinah opened it, and it was her own obituary of him, her sentences. Her rhythms with one line amended in his careful hand, where she had written, "He is survived by a city that never knew him." Silas had crossed out the ending and written, "He is survived by his wife, who knew him completely, and married him anyway. It's presumptuous," he said quietly. The most feared man on the Gulf Coast was not quite managing to look at her. Editorially, "It's premature," Dinah said, through the tears ruining her vision. Factually, she looked up at him. "You'd have to ask me first." So he did, on one knee, on the levee, with his grandmother's ring that Odette had kept sewn in a hem through 11 years of being dead, while the river went bronze in the last light, and Dinah Vance, who had spent her whole career giving other people perfect endings, finally answered one out loud. They were married on All Saints' Day, 1 year exactly from the funeral he attended alive at Street Roche, because Silas said a place should hold your best day and your strangest one, and because his mother wanted the walk to be short. The 9-year-old from the music school played trumpet, imperfectly and gloriously. Baptiste wept, enormously, and blamed the incense. And late that night, when the second line had wound itself out, and the city had gone soft and golden, Dinah found her husband on the townhouse balcony with the river wind in his hair. Reading one more time, she knew it by the fold, the amended page. "You know what still frightens me about it," Silas said, without turning. "Because he always knew where she was, the way you know where your own heartbeat is. That obituary. You wrote the whole truth of me before we'd ever spoken a word. I spent 30 years making sure no living soul could do that." He turned then and drew her in against the wind, and his voice dropped to the register that belonged only to her, the one under all the others. "So tell me, Mrs. Duquesne, what does a man do about the one person who can see him?" Dinah smiled up at the king of the Gulf Coast and gave him the last line. "He makes sure she's writing the sequel."